The small town of Ridgewood in Austria had never seen anything quite like what happened on that cold November evening in 2019. The community center was hosting its annual children's talent show, and parents filled the wooden chairs, cameras ready, expecting the usual mix of awkward singing and simple dance routines. Nobody was prepared for what a 5-year-old boy named Lucas Weber would do on that stage. Lucas was the son of Maria and Thomas Weber, a simple couple who ran a bakery on the corner of the main street. Maria had never played an instrument in her life. Thomas could barely remember the words to Happy Birthday. Music was not part of their world. They did not own a piano. They did not play classical records at home. They did not even have a music streaming service. Their house was filled with the smell of fresh bread, not the sound of symphonies. When Lucas walked onto the stage that night, his small shoes barely made a sound on the wooden floor. He wore a white shirt that was slightly too big for him, and his blonde hair was combed neatly to one side. His mother had dressed him carefully that morning, not knowing that this day would change everything. The audience smiled at the cute little boy, expecting him to play some simple nursery rhyme on the old piano that sat in the corner of the stage. But Lucas did not play a nursery rhyme. He sat down on the bench, adjusted it slightly like a professional would, and placed his small fingers on the keys. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then he began to play. The notes that filled the room were not from a children's song. They were from Mozart's Piano Sonata, No. 16 in C major. The piece flowed from his tiny fingers with a skill and emotion that seemed impossible for a child his age. The parents in the audience stopped whispering. The children stopped fidgeting. Even the event organizer, a retired music teacher named Helena Brown, stood frozen near the curtain. She had taught piano for 43 years. She had seen talented children before, but she had never seen anything like this. The boy was not just playing the notes correctly. He was playing them with feeling, with understanding, with a depth that took musicians decades to develop. Maria Weber sat in the third row, her hand gripping her husband's arm so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Tears began to fall down her cheeks, though she did not know why. Thomas sat with his mouth slightly open, unable to process what he was seeing. This was their son, their little Lucas who still needed help tying his shoes, their boy who had never had a single piano lesson in his life. The performance lasted nearly 8 minutes. When Lucas finished, he lifted his hands from the keys and sat very still. The silence in the room lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then Helena Brown began to clap, slowly at first, then faster. The rest of the audience followed, rising to their feet, giving a standing ovation to a 5-year-old boy who had just performed one of the most technically difficult pieces of classical music, as if it were as natural as breathing. But the applause stopped suddenly when Lucas did something strange. He turned to face the audience, and his eyes seemed different somehow. They were distant, unfocused, as if he were looking at something far away that nobody else could see. Then he spoke in a clear, calm voice that carried across the silent room. "The taste of death is upon my lips," he said. "I feel something that is not of this earth." Maria felt her heart stop. She knew those words. She had read them once, years ago, in a book about famous composers. Those were the last words spoken by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart on his deathbed in 1791. Her 5-year-old son, who had never studied music or history, had just quoted the dying words of a man who had been dead for over 200 years. The audience murmured in confusion. Some people laughed nervously, thinking it was part of a strange act. But Helena Brown did not laugh. She walked slowly toward the stage, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had dedicated her entire life to the music of Mozart. She had visited his birthplace in Salzburg. She had read every biography, every letter, every account of his final days. And she knew, without any doubt, that what Lucas had just said was historically accurate, down to the last word. Lucas remained seated at the piano, his small body perfectly still. His parents rushed toward the stage, calling his name, but he did not respond. It was as if he were in a trance, lost somewhere between this world and another. When Maria finally reached him and touched his shoulder, He turned to look at her with eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "Mama," he said softly, "why did they not finish my requiem?" Maria felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She did not know what a requiem was. She did not know that Mozart had been working on a requiem mass when he died, and that it had remained unfinished at his death. But somehow, impossibly, her son knew. Her son who had never read a book about Mozart. Her son who had never even heard the name Mozart until that very moment. The talent show was forgotten. The other children never performed. The community center emptied as people left in confused silence, whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. But for the Weber family, this was only the beginning. This was the night that everything changed. This was the night that made them question everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the mysterious connection that might exist between souls across the centuries. Helena Braun stayed behind, sitting alone in the empty hall, staring at the piano where Lucas had performed his impossible miracle. She had spent her entire life studying music, searching for something she could never quite name. And now, in this small community center in a town nobody had ever heard of, she believed she had finally found it. The question that burned in her mind was simple but terrifying. Who was Lucas Weber, really? And whose memories were living inside his young mind? The days following the talent show were chaos for the Weber family. Maria could not sleep. She would lie awake at night, watching Lucas through the crack in his bedroom door, as if she expected him to do something extraordinary at any moment. Thomas tried to convince himself that what had happened was a coincidence, that Lucas had perhaps heard the music somewhere and memorized it without realizing. But deep down, he knew that explanation made no sense. A 5-year-old cannot simply memorize and perfectly perform a complex Mozart sonata by hearing it once. Helena Braun visited their bakery 3 days after the talent show. She brought with her a folder full of printed pages, her hands shaking as she placed them on the flour-dusted counter. Maria wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the old woman with a mixture of hope and fear. "I have not slept since that night," Helena said. "I have been researching, reading, trying to understand." She opened the folder and spread the pages across the counter. They were printed from websites about reincarnation, past life memories in children, and famous cases from around the world. Thomas came out from the back room, crossing his arms over his chest. He was a practical man who believed in hard work and simple explanations. He did not believe in ghosts or spirits or lives lived before this one. But his son had shaken his certainty to its core. "There have been documented cases," Helena explained, her voice low and intense. "Children who remember previous lives. Children who know things they could not possibly know. There was a boy in India who remembered being a man from a village 50 miles away. He knew the names of the man's family members, the layout of his house, the way he died. Everything was verified. It was real." Maria picked up one of the printed pages with trembling fingers. It described a case study of a 3-year-old in America who claimed to have been a World War II pilot. The child knew details about planes and battles that historians confirmed. He knew the name of the aircraft carrier. He knew the names of fellow pilots. He had nightmares about dying in a crash, and researchers eventually found records of a pilot who matched every detail the boy described. "You think our Lucas is like this?" Maria whispered. "You think he was Mozart in a previous life?" Helena paused before answering. "I do not know what I think, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that those words he spoke were Mozart's final words. Nobody taught him that. Nobody could have. It is not in any children's book. It is barely mentioned in adult biographies. He knew it as if he had lived it." That evening, after closing the bakery, Maria and Thomas sat with Lucas in their small living room. They had placed a keyboard on the coffee table, borrowed from a neighbor whose children had long since abandoned their music lessons. Lucas sat cross-legged on the carpet, looking at the keyboard with curious eyes. "Lucas," Maria said gently, "can you tell us about the music you played at the show?" Lucas tilted his head, considering the question. "It was my music," he said simply. "What do you mean, your music?" Thomas asked. "I wrote it. A long time ago. When I was big. Lucas reached out and pressed a key on the keyboard, smiling at the sound it made. I wrote lots of music. So much music. But I could not finish the last one. I was too tired. My body hurt too much. Maria exchanged a glance with her husband. Her throat felt tight, as if she might cry at any moment. Lucas, sweetheart, do you remember being someone else? Before you were Lucas? The boy looked up at his mother, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to hold a depth of sadness that no child should possess. I was Wolfgang, he said. That was my name. Wolfgang Amadeus. My papa called me Wolfrel when I was small. My sister was Nannerl. We played music together. She was very good, but papa said I was better. I did not like it when he said that. It made Nannerl sad. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had never heard these names before, but he pulled out his phone and quickly searched. His face went pale as he read the results. Mozart's nickname as a child was indeed Wolfrel. His sister's name was Maria Anna, but she was called Nannerl by the family. These were not commonly known facts. They were buried in historical records that most people never encountered. Over the following weeks, Lucas revealed more and more details about his supposed previous life. He described the house where he grew up in Salzburg, mentioning specific rooms and the location of the harpsichord. He talked about traveling across Europe as a child, performing for kings and queens. He remembered the powdered wigs and the candles, and the way his fingers ached after long performances. Helena Brown documented everything. She recorded their conversations and compared Lucas's statements to historical records. The accuracy was frightening. Lucas mentioned a pet starling that he had owned, a bird that could sing parts of his compositions. Historical records confirmed that Mozart did indeed have a pet starling and was deeply attached to it. Lucas described the coffee houses of Vienna and the taste of a specific pastry that he loved. Researchers verified that this pastry was popular in Vienna during Mozart's time. But the most chilling moment came when Lucas began to cry one evening, seemingly without reason. Maria rushed to him, holding him close, asking what was wrong. I remember dying, Lucas sobbed. I was so cold. Everything hurt. There was a man with a black book. He wanted me to write music for the dead. A requiem. I worked and worked, but I could not finish it. I knew I was running out of time. The fever took everything from me. And then I was gone. And my music was not finished. Maria held her son tightly, tears streaming down her own face. She did not fully understand what was happening, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever her son was experiencing, it was real to him. These were not fantasies or stories. These were memories. Memories that belonged to a man who had died over 2 centuries ago. Word began to spread through Ridgewood about the extraordinary boy. People came to the bakery not just for bread, but to catch a glimpse of Lucas. Some believed he was a miracle. Others thought the Webbers were playing some elaborate hoax. But nobody who met Lucas and heard him speak could deny that there was something deeply unusual about him. Something that defied explanation. Something that made even the most skeptical person question what they thought they knew about the boundaries between life and death. The news about Lucas spread beyond the small town of Ridgewood faster than anyone expected. A local journalist named Marcus Richter had attended the talent show that fateful evening, originally intending to write a light human interest piece about the children's performances. Instead, he had witnessed something that kept him awake for weeks. He wrote a detailed article that was picked up by a major Austrian newspaper, and within days, the story of the boy, who might be Mozart reborn, was making headlines across Europe. The Weber family was unprepared for the attention. Their quiet bakery became surrounded by reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. Maria had to hire extra help just to manage the sudden rush of customers, many of whom had no interest in bread, but simply wanted to see the famous boy. Thomas grew increasingly protective, standing at the door and turning away anyone who seemed too aggressive or intrusive. But it was an email that changed everything. It came from Dr. Ingrid Hoffmann, a professor of psychology at the University of Vienna who specialized in the study of past life memories in children. She had spent 20 years researching cases similar to Lucas's, traveling the world to interview children who claimed to remember previous lives. Her work was considered controversial by mainstream academics, but she had documented dozens of cases that could not be easily explained away. Dr. Hoffman requested a meeting with the Weber family, and after much discussion, Maria and Thomas agreed. They were desperate for answers, for some kind of framework to understand what was happening to their son. 2 weeks later, Dr. Hoffman arrived in Ridgewood, accompanied by her research assistant, a young man named Felix, who carried recording equipment and notebooks filled with questions. The meeting took place in the Webers' living room, with Lucas sitting on the carpet surrounded by toys that he rarely played with anymore. He preferred the keyboard, spending hours pressing keys and humming melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his memory. Dr. Hoffman watched him for several minutes before speaking, her eyes sharp and analytical behind her glasses. "Lucas," she said gently, "I would like to ask you some questions. Is that all right?" Lucas nodded without looking up from the keyboard. "Can you tell me about your house? The house where you lived when you were Wolfgang?" Lucas paused his playing and closed his eyes, as if searching through a vast library of memories. "It was on Getreidegasse," he said. "The street was narrow. There were shops. We lived on the 3rd floor. The stairs creaked. I had to practice so many hours every day. My fingers would hurt, but Papa said I could not stop. The music had to be perfect." Felix scribbled notes furiously. Dr. Hoffman maintained her calm expression, though her heart was racing. Mozart's birthplace was indeed on Getreidegasse in Salzburg, and the family had occupied the 3rd floor of the building. This was historically accurate information, but it could theoretically have been learned from books or the internet. "Can you tell me about something that happened to you? A specific memory?" Lucas opened his eyes and looked directly at Dr. Hoffman. His gaze was unsettling, too steady for a child of his age. "I remember when the Empress kissed me," he said. "I was 6 years old. We played for her in Vienna. She was very beautiful, and her palace was like a dream. After I played, I climbed onto her lap and kissed her cheek. Everyone laughed. Papa was embarrassed, but the Empress said I was charming." Dr. Hoffman felt a chill run through her body. This story was documented in historical records. A young Mozart had indeed performed for Empress Maria, Teresa of Austria, and had famously climbed onto her lap and kissed her. It was a well-known anecdote among Mozart scholars, but it was not the kind of story that would appear in a children's book or casual internet search. The interview continued for 3 hours. Lucas described performances in London, Paris, and Munich. He talked about meeting other composers and musicians, whose names he pronounced with surprising accuracy. He remembered the illnesses that plagued his childhood, the carriage rides across Europe, the exhaustion of constant travel and performance. But there was one question that Dr. Hoffman had been saving, one test that would be nearly impossible to fake. She pulled out a sheet of music paper and placed it on the coffee table in front of Lucas. "Wolfgang," she said, deliberately using the name from his memories. "Can you write some music for me? Something you remember composing?" Lucas picked up the pencil that Felix offered him. He held it awkwardly, as a 5-year-old would, but his eyes focused on the paper with intense concentration. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to draw notes on the staff lines. The process was difficult for his small hands, and several times he had to stop and shake out his fingers. But after nearly an hour, he had filled 2 pages with musical notation. Dr. Hoffman took the pages carefully, as if handling a priceless artifact. She would need to have them analyzed by musicologists, but even to her untrained eye, the notation looked legitimate. The notes were arranged in patterns that seemed structured and intentional, not random scribbles. "What is this music?" she asked. "It is from the Requiem," Lucas said, his voice heavy with sadness. "The part I could not finish. It is still in my head. It has always been in my head. I could never let it go." Maria Weber watched this exchange with tears in her eyes. She did not understand music or history, but she understood her son. She understood the weight that seemed to press down on his small shoulders, the sorrow that lived behind his eyes. Whatever was happening, It was not a game to Lucas. It was not a fantasy or a bid for attention. It was a burden that he carried, a connection to something vast and incomprehensible. Dr. Hoffmann stayed in Ridgewood for 5 days, conducting more interviews, recording Lucas's responses, and gathering as much documentation as possible. When she finally left, she told the Webbers that she had never encountered a case as compelling as their son's. "I cannot tell you definitively what is happening," she admitted. "Science does not have a framework for this. But I can tell you that Lucas knows things that he should not be able to know. The probability of coincidence is essentially zero. Whatever the explanation, something extraordinary is occurring with your son." Those words offered little comfort to Maria and Thomas. They did not want their son to be extraordinary. They wanted him to be normal, to play with other children, to grow up without the weight of past lives pressing down on his spirit. But as they watched Lucas return to his keyboard, his small fingers moving across the keys with unnatural grace, they understood that normal was no longer an option. Their son had been touched by something beyond their understanding, and their only choice was to walk this strange path alongside him. The music sheets that Lucas had written were sent to 3 independent musicologists in 3 different countries. Dr. Hoffmann wanted to eliminate any possibility of bias or contamination. She did not tell the experts anything about the source of the music. She simply asked them to analyze the notation and provide their professional assessment. The results came back within 2 weeks, and they were stunning. All 3 musicologists independently concluded that the music was written in the style of late 18th century classical composition. The harmonic structures, the melodic patterns, the rhythmic choices were all consistent with the period. One expert from the Royal Academy of Music in London wrote that the composition showed remarkable sophistication and could easily be mistaken for a fragment of an unknown work by a major composer of that era. But it was the 3rd expert, a German professor named Dr. Wilhelm Krauss, who had spent his entire career studying Mozart's works, who provided the most shocking assessment. He recognized the musical phrases. They matched fragments of Mozart's unfinished Requiem in D minor, specifically portions that had never been completed by the composer himself. What Lucas had written appeared to be a continuation of music that had remained incomplete for over 200 years. Dr. Krauss flew to Austria to meet Lucas personally. He was a stern man in his 60s, skeptical by nature and training. He did not believe in reincarnation or past lives. He believed in evidence, documentation, and rigorous analysis. But what he encountered in the Weber family's modest home shook the foundations of everything he thought he knew. He brought with him original manuscripts, copies of Mozart's handwriting, and recordings of his complete works. He sat with Lucas for hours, playing pieces and asking the boy to identify them. Lucas recognized almost everything, not just by name, but by context. He would close his eyes and describe where he had been when he wrote a particular piece, what he had been feeling, what difficulties he had faced in the composition process. When Dr. Krauss played a recording of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21, Lucas began to cry softly. "I wrote this for my wedding," he said. "I was so happy then. Constanze was beautiful in her dress. I thought we would be happy forever. I did not know how little time I would have." The professor paused the recording and stared at the boy. Constanze was indeed the name of Mozart's wife, and the concerto was written around the time of their marriage. These were not commonly known facts. Most people who knew of Mozart knew only the broad strokes of his life, not these intimate details. "How do you know these things?" Dr. Krauss asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas looked at the professor with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. "I do not know how. I just remember. It is like waking up from a long sleep and slowly remembering a dream. Every day, more pieces come back. Sometimes they are happy memories. Sometimes they're sad. But they are all mine. They have always been mine." The professor's visit lasted a full week. By the end, he had accumulated hours of recordings and dozens of pages of notes. He had tested Lucas in every way he could imagine, and every test had produced results that defied rational explanation. The boy knew things that he could not have learned from any contemporary source. He knew the layout of rooms and buildings that no longer existed. He knew the names of people who had been forgotten by history. He knew the taste of foods and the smell of streets that had not existed for centuries. When Dr. Cross returned to Germany, he faced a professional crisis. He could not publish his findings through traditional academic channels. The scientific community would dismiss them as fantasy or fraud. But he also could not ignore what he had witnessed. His solution was to write a private report and share it only with a small circle of trusted colleagues, hoping that someone might eventually find a way to investigate further without destroying their career. Meanwhile, the attention on the Weber family continued to grow. Documentary filmmakers reached out, offering substantial amounts of money to film Lucas and his family. Talk show producers sent invitations for appearances in Vienna, Berlin, and London. A Hollywood studio expressed interest in making a movie about the boy who remembered being. Mozart, Maria, and Thomas rejected all of these offers. They did not want their son to become a spectacle, a circus act for the entertainment of curious audiences. They wanted to protect him, to give him as normal a childhood as possible, despite the extraordinary circumstances. But protecting Lucas was becoming increasingly difficult. Strangers would approach him on the street. Letters arrived at the bakery from all over the world, some offering support and some accusing the family of fraud or demonic possession. The religious community in Ridgewood was particularly divided. The local priest, Father Bernhard, was a progressive man who approached the situation with curiosity rather than condemnation. He met with Lucas several times and came away impressed by the boy's gentleness and sincerity. But other religious figures were not so understanding. A group of evangelical Christians from a nearby city held a protest outside the bakery, claiming that Lucas was possessed by a demonic spirit and needed to be exorcised. This accusation hurt Maria deeply. She knew her son better than anyone, and there was nothing evil or dark about him. He was kind to animals, generous with other children, and quick to comfort anyone who seemed sad. If he was possessed by anything, it was by beauty and music and a profound connection to the artistic genius of a man long dead. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of dealing with protesters and reporters, Maria sat with Lucas in his bedroom. She watched him play with a small wooden horse that Thomas had carved for him, and she felt her heart break for the impossible situation they were all in. "Lucas," she said softly, "are you happy?" The boy looked up at his mother and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am happy to have you and Papa," he said. "I am happy to have my music. But sometimes I am very tired. It is hard to remember two lives at once. It is hard to be two people inside one body." Maria gathered her son into her arms and held him tightly. She did not have answers for him. She did not have solutions. All she had was love, and she poured every ounce of it into that embrace, hoping that somehow it would be enough to carry him through whatever challenges lay ahead. As Lucas grew older, his memories of his previous life did not fade as many researchers had expected. In most documented cases of children with past life memories, the recollections typically began to diminish around the age of 7 or 8, eventually disappearing entirely by adolescence. But Lucas was different. If anything, his memories became clearer, more detailed, more vivid as the years passed. By the time Lucas turned 8, he had become one of the most studied individuals in the field of consciousness research. Dr. Hoffman had published multiple papers about his case, carefully anonymizing the details to protect the family's privacy while still presenting the extraordinary evidence she had gathered. Academic conferences featured discussions about the boy who remembered being Mozart. Though many mainstream scientists dismissed the claims as pseudoscience or wishful thinking, Lucas began formal piano lessons at the age of 6. Not because he needed to learn how to play, but because his parents wanted to give him a structured environment where his talents could be properly developed. His teacher was Helena Brown, the retired music teacher who had first witnessed his performance at the talent show. She had come out of retirement specifically to work with him, seeing it as the final and most important purpose of her long career. Their lessons were unlike anything Helena had ever experienced. She would begin to teach a new technique, only to have Lucas complete the instruction before she finished explaining it. He seemed to already know everything she had to offer, merely needing her guidance to translate his internal knowledge into the physical movements of his young hands. "It is strange," Lucas told Helena during one of their sessions. "My fingers are small and clumsy. They do not move the way I remember them moving. It is frustrating. The music is perfect in my mind, but it comes out imperfect through these hands." Helena understood what he meant. His technical skill far exceeded what should be possible for a child his age, but it still fell short of professional adult performance, simply due to the physical limitations of his young body. The music that lived inside him was trapped, waiting for his body to grow strong enough to fully express it. But it was not only music that continued to emerge from Lucas's memories. He began to speak more and more about the circumstances of Mozart's death, details that became increasingly troubling for those who heard them. He spoke of a mysterious stranger who had commissioned the Requiem, a man who wore dark clothing and never revealed his true identity. He spoke of growing increasingly ill, convinced that he was being poisoned, that someone wanted him dead. "I knew I was dying," Lucas said during one documented interview with Dr. Hoffman. "I could feel the poison in my body. It was slow, like a cold river flowing through my veins. I told Constanza, but she did not believe me. She thought I was being paranoid. But I knew. I always knew." These statements stirred controversy among Mozart scholars and historians. The official cause of Mozart's death had been debated for centuries. Various theories had been proposed, from rheumatic fever to kidney disease to mercury poisoning. Some historians believed that Mozart was murdered by a jealous rival, while others dismissed such theories as romantic fiction. Lucas's memories added fuel to the murder theories, providing what some considered first-hand testimony of poisoning. Dr. Krause, the German musicologist who had visited Lucas years earlier, was particularly fascinated by these claims. He began researching the circumstances of Mozart's death more intensively than ever, looking for any evidence that might support or contradict the boy's memories. He examined contemporary accounts, medical records from the period, and correspondence between Mozart and his family. The more he researched, the more he found troubling inconsistencies in the official narrative. Mozart had died on December 5, 1791, just weeks after the mysterious stranger had commissioned the Requiem. His symptoms had progressed rapidly, and by the end, he was too weak to even hold a quill to continue working on the composition. He was 35 years old, at the height of his creative powers, with no previous history of serious illness. His death had shocked the musical world, and had been followed by a funeral so modest that his body was buried in an unmarked, communal grave. Lucas knew all of these details without being told. He knew the date. He knew the symptoms. He knew about the unmarked grave, and this particular memory caused him visible distress whenever it was mentioned. "They buried me like a pauper," he once said to his mother, tears streaming down his face. "I wrote music for emperors and kings, and they threw my body into a hole with strangers. Nobody knows where my bones lie. Nobody can visit me. It is as if I never existed at all." Maria did not know how to comfort her son during these moments. How do you console a child who is mourning his own death from a previous life? How do you help him process grief that is over 2 centuries old? Lucas's school life was complicated by his unusual circumstances. Most of his classmates knew about his claimed past life, though their understanding varied widely. Some children were fascinated and treated him like a celebrity. Others were frightened and avoided him. A few cruel ones mocked him relentlessly, calling him crazy or accusing his family of staging an elaborate hoax for fame and money. Despite these challenges, Lucas remained a gentle and kind child. He did not seek attention or fame. He did not brag about his abilities or his memories. He simply wanted to play his music, to finally complete the Requiem that had haunted him for 2 lifetimes, and to live as normal a life as his extraordinary circumstances would allow. By the time Lucas was 10 years old, he had composed over 50 original pieces of music, all in the classical style of the late 18th century. Musicologists who analyzed his work were uniformly astonished. The compositions showed a level of sophistication and emotional depth that typically required decades of training and experience to achieve. Critics who reviewed recordings of his performances described them as transcendent, as if the spirit of Mozart himself was speaking through the young boy's fingers. Lucas was not interested in critical acclaim or professional success. His focus was singular and unwavering. He spent every available moment working on the Requiem, determined to finally complete the work that had been interrupted by death over 200 years ago. The unfinished Requiem was not just a musical project for him. It was unfinished business, a debt owed to the universe, a story that needed its proper ending. The completion of the Requiem became an obsession for Lucas as he approached his 12th birthday. He had grown into a serious and thoughtful boy, tall for his age, with the same intense eyes that had startled audiences when he was 5 years old. The playfulness of early childhood had given way to a focused determination that sometimes worried his parents. He would spend hours at the piano, working through passages, revising sections, occasionally becoming so frustrated that he would pound the keys in anger before collecting himself and beginning again. Maria and Thomas had long since adjusted to the reality of their extraordinary son. The bakery still operated, though it had become more of a local landmark than a simple business. Tourists would visit Ridgewood specifically to see the place where the boy who was Mozart reborn lived and worked. The Webers had hired additional staff to handle the demand, and the extra income allowed them to provide Lucas with a professional-grade grand piano that dominated their small living room. Dr. Hoffman continued to document Lucas's progress, visiting several times a year to conduct interviews and assessments. She had become something like an aunt to the family, a trusted presence who understood their situation better than almost anyone else in the world. Her research had attracted the attention of other scientists interested in consciousness and memory, and a small but growing academic community now took the possibility of past life memory seriously. It was during one of Dr. Hoffman's visits that Lucas made an announcement that stunned everyone present. He had been working at the piano for several hours, refusing meals and breaks despite his mother's protests. Finally, as the sun began to set outside the windows, he lifted his hands from the keys and sat in silence for a long moment. "It is finished," he said quietly. Maria, Thomas, Helena Braun, and Dr. Hoffman all gathered around him. On the music stand sat nearly 50 pages of handwritten notation, the culmination of years of work. Lucas looked exhausted but peaceful, as if a great weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "The Requiem is complete," he continued. "After all these years, after all this time, I have finally finished it." Helena Braun took the manuscript with trembling hands and began to read through the notation. Tears formed in her eyes as she recognized the genius of the composition, the way it seamlessly continued from where Mozart's original work had been interrupted. The musical language was consistent, the emotional arc was perfect, and the final sections brought the piece to a conclusion that felt both inevitable and profoundly moving. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." The completion of the Requiem created a new wave of global attention. News outlets around the world covered the story, and the debate about Lucas's claimed past life intensified. Skeptics pointed out that Lucas had had access to Mozart's incomplete Requiem for years and could have simply studied it and created a stylistically similar continuation. They argued that talented composers had done similar work throughout history, and there was no need to invoke supernatural explanations. But those who had known Lucas, who had witnessed his memories and tested his knowledge, believed otherwise. They knew that what Lucas had produced was not the result of study or imitation. It came from somewhere deeper, from a place that science could not yet explain. The premiere of Lucas's completed Requiem took place in Vienna, in the same city where Mozart had died over 2 centuries earlier. The Vienna Philharmonic performed the work, and tickets sold out within minutes of becoming available. The concert hall was filled with musicologists, historians, journalists, and ordinary people who had been moved by Lucas's story. Lucas himself sat in the front row, flanked by his parents. He wore a formal black suit that made him look older than his 12 years. His face was calm, almost serene, as the orchestra began to play. The music filled the hall, and those who knew Mozart's original work could barely detect where the old composition ended, and Lucas's continuation began. It was seamless, unified, whole. When the final notes faded into silence, the audience sat in stunned stillness. Then, slowly, the applause began. It built and built until the entire hall was on its feet, cheering and weeping and celebrating what they had just witnessed. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 15 minutes, but Lucas did not seem to notice the applause. His eyes were closed, and tears were streaming down his face. His mother reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Are you all right?" she asked. Lucas opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression of profound peace. "It is finished," he said again. "After 230 years, it is finally finished. I can rest now. I can finally rest." Those words would prove to be more significant than anyone realized at the time. In the months following the premiere, Lucas began to change. The intensity that had driven him for years seemed to soften. He still played piano, but without the desperate urgency that had characterized his work on the Requiem. He spent more time with friends, more time outdoors, more time simply being a normal 12-year-old boy. His memories of his previous life did not disappear, but they seemed to fade into the background, no longer demanding his constant attention. It was as if the completion of the Requiem had allowed something inside him to finally heal, to find the closure that had eluded him across the barrier of death and rebirth. Dr. Hoffman noticed the change during her next visit. "You seem different," she observed. "Lighter, somehow." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "I spent so many years carrying unfinished work. It was like a stone on my chest. Every day, every hour, I could feel it pressing down on me. The music that wanted to be born, but could not be. The story that had no ending. Now the stone is gone. I can breathe again." The professor smiled and made a note in her ever-present notebook. She had studied dozens of cases of past life memories, but none had ever reached such a clear resolution. Most children simply forgot their previous lives as they grew older, the memories fading like dreams upon waking. Lucas's experience was different. He had not forgotten. He had completed. And in doing so, he had perhaps found a kind of peace that transcends the boundaries of a single lifetime. Years passed, and Lucas Weber grew into a young man who carried his extraordinary history with quiet grace. By the time he was 18, he had graduated from a prestigious music conservatory in Vienna, not as a child prodigy to be gawked at, but as a serious musician who had earned his place through talent and dedication. His completed Requiem had been performed by orchestras around the world and had become a significant part of the classical music repertoire, studied by students and celebrated by audiences who knew nothing of its unusual origins. The debate about Lucas's past life memories never fully resolved. Some people believed completely in the reality of his experience, seeing it as proof of reincarnation and the continuity of the soul across lifetimes. Others remained skeptical, attributing his abilities and knowledge to some combination of genetic gifts, unconscious learning, a remarkable coincidence. Most people fell somewhere in between, uncertain what to believe, but moved by the story regardless. Lucas himself rarely spoke publicly about his memories anymore. In interviews, he would acknowledge his past, but preferred to focus on his current work and future plans. He had developed a philosophy about his experience that he shared with his mother during a quiet conversation on his 18th birthday. "I do not know if I am Mozart reborn," he said, sitting beside Maria in the garden behind the bakery. "I do not know if reincarnation is real, or if my memories are something else entirely. What I know is that I carried music inside me that needed to be released. I carried unfinished work that demanded completion. Whether those things belong to Mozart or to some part of myself that I do not understand, the result was the same. The Requiem is finished. The music exists. That is what matters." Maria listened to her son with pride and wonder. The frightened 5-year-old who had spoken Mozart's dying words on a community center stage had grown into a thoughtful, grounded young man. The journey had been difficult, filled with challenges that no family should have to face. But they had faced them together, and they had emerged on the other side, stronger and closer than ever. Helena Brown passed away peacefully in her sleep the year Lucas turned 19. She had lived just long enough to see her student complete his formal education and begin his professional career. At her funeral, Lucas played a piece he had composed specifically for her, a gentle melody that captured the kindness and dedication she had shown him throughout his childhood. Those who attended the service would later say it was the most beautiful music they had ever heard. Dr. Hoffman published a comprehensive book about Lucas's case when he was 21. The book became an international bestseller and sparked renewed academic interest in the study of past life memories. Universities began funding research programs, and new cases emerged from around the world, children who remembered lives they could not possibly have lived. Whether or not science would ever fully explain these phenomena, the door to investigation had been opened, and serious researchers were finally walking through it. The Weber Bakery remained the heart of Ridgewood, though it was now run primarily by Thomas, with help from hired assistants. Maria had retired to focus on writing her own memoir about raising an extraordinary child, a project that Lucas encouraged and supported. Their book would eventually be published and would offer a deeply personal perspective on the public story that so many people thought they knew. As for Lucas, he pursued a career as a classical pianist and composer, though he avoided the spotlight whenever possible. He performed in concert halls around the world, but rarely gave interviews or appeared on television. He married a cellist named Anna, whom he had met at the conservatory, and together they had 2 children who showed no signs of past life memories, but who inherited their parents' love of music. One evening, when Lucas was in his late 20s, he found himself alone in his Vienna apartment, sitting at his piano as the sun set over the city. His children were asleep, and Anna was away performing with a chamber ensemble. He played softly, fragments of melodies old and new, allowing his fingers to wander across the keys without any particular purpose. As he played, he thought about the strange journey his life had been. He thought about the little boy who had climbed onto a stage and performed Mozart with impossible skill. He thought about the words he had spoken, words that had belonged to a dying man 2 centuries ago. He thought about the years of research and attention and controversy, the struggle to complete work that had been interrupted by death, the profound relief of finally finishing what had been left undone. And he thought about what it all meant, if it meant anything at all. Perhaps souls did travel from life to life, carrying unfinished business until it could be resolved. Perhaps consciousness was more complex and mysterious than anyone understood. Or perhaps there were simpler explanations that would someday be discovered. Explanations that would make his extraordinary experiences seem ordinary in retrospect. Lucas did not know the answers to these questions, and he had long since made peace with that uncertainty. What he knew was that he had been given a gift, whether from a previous life or from some other source entirely. He had been given music that demanded to be played, stories that demanded to be told, and a mission that demanded to be completed. He had fulfilled that mission to the best of his ability, and now he was free to live the rest of his life on his own terms. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and the room filled with the soft blue light of twilight. Lucas finished the melody he had been playing and let his hands rest on the keys. In the silence that followed, he felt something he had not felt since childhood, a presence, a connection, a sense that he was not entirely alone. "Thank you," he whispered into the empty room. "Thank you for the music. Thank you for the chance to finish what you started. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you have found peace." The feeling faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Lucas alone with his thoughts and his piano. He smiled softly, closed the lid over the keys, and went to check on his sleeping children. The past was the past. The music was complete, and the future, whatever it might hold, was waiting to be written. Outside the window, the stars began to appear over Vienna. The same stars that had shone over Mozart as he lay dying in this same city so many years ago. The connection between past and present, between one life and another, remained a mystery that might never be solved. But in that mystery, there was also beauty and hope, and the promise that nothing of value is ever truly lost. The music lives on. The soul finds its way home. And sometimes, against all odds and expectations, unfinished business finally gets finished.